Before the US Army created its armored force, it had quite a few tank units milling around, or at least quite a few compared to literally nothing. These tank units, whether by resources or by lineage, went on to form some of the first tank battalions that fight World War II. And it was pure chaos. Everything was converted into something else. Units were inactivated or reactivated, cadreed, had personnel transferred one way and tanks the other. This is kind of a big topic, so the video was split into two distinct parts. The first half covers regular Army and National Guard units that were instrumental in forming the 1st Armored Divisions and separate tank battalions. The second half covers units in the Organized Reserve, because they had less of a role to play in forming armored force units, but held trained officers for future mobilization. On the grandest scale, Army tank forces were split between its two maneuver branches, the Infantry and Cavalry. The Infantry was the legal proponent of tank forces as per the National Defense Act of 1920. As late as 1939, the following elements were active. One partially active light tank regiment, the 66th Infantry, with its 3 battalions spread between Fort Meade, Fort Benning, and Camp Devens, but inactive regimental HQ, so really more like 3 light tank battalions than a proper regiment. One partially activated medium tank battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 67th Infantry Regiment medium tanks. 8 active divisional light tank companies in the regular army, and 18 in the National Guard. In infantry divisions, these were numbered the same as their division, except for the Hawaiian Division with its 11th Tank Company. Other divisions, like the Cavalry divisions, also had a light tank company in their TO&E, but these were all inactive at the time. Also note that National Guard tank companies were very much shell formations, with only 2 or 3 tanks per company for training purposes, and only single platoons of the 5th and 6th tank companies were active. On the cavalry side of the house, because they were not legally allowed to have tanks, their light tanks were actually called combat cars, although they weren't all that different. The only such units up to 1939 were part of the 7th Cavalry Brigade Mechanized, whose 2 regiments each had a combat car squadron. Before we get to the units that fought World War II, there were a few consequential conversions that happened immediately before the Louisiana maneuvers. First, in the cavalry, a separate combat car squadron was formed at Fort Riley, Kansas in early 1940, with limited combat car deliveries commencing in March. For the infantry, on January 1, 1940, the 1st and 4th Tank Companies, 1st Platoon 5th Tank Company, and 2nd Platoon 6th Tank Company were converted into 1st Battalion of the 68th Infantry, a previously inactive light tank regiment, Companies A, B, and C respectively. The 5th and 6th companies were consolidated as they were only partially active. The 2nd, 3rd, and 7th Tank Companies meanwhile became the 68th Infantry's 2nd Battalion, Companies D, E, and F respectively. This left the 11th Tank Company in Hawaii as the only regular Army Divisional Tank Company active. The Regimental HQ and HQ Company of the 66th Infantry was also reactivated on January 10, 1940. All 6 tank battalions were then formed into the Provisional Tank Brigade under Brigadier General Bruce Magruder. This 6 battalion formation was the largest infantry tank unit in the US Army to that date, as the interwar Army conceived the tank battalion as the largest administrative and tactical unit. During the Louisiana maneuvers of May 1940, they formed a Provisional Armored Division alongside the 7th Cavalry Brigade. The month after, on June 5, 1940, the entire 67th Infantry Regiment medium tanks was activated at Fort Benning. Now, with that out of the way, the armored force. I think it'll be most useful to organize it by the final units. The armored divisions, separate tank battalions, and then the random stuff. The initial armored force as organized in July of 1940 was to consist of the 1st Armored Corps with the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions, and the separate 70th Tank Battalion as a General HQ Reserve unit. In simple terms, the tank components of the 1st Armored Division were mostly resourced from the cavalry, and the 2nd Armored Division and 70th Tanks from the infantry. Both divisions had supporting arms and an infantry regiment each, but for the sake of time, I'm only covering the armored units. The HQ and HQ troop of the 7th Cavalry Brigade Mechanized was redesignated as the HQ and HQ Company of the 1st Armored Division at Fort Knox. The brigade had 2 mechanized regiments, the 1st and 13th Cavalry, which were redesignated as the 1st and 13th Armored Regiments Light respectively. The separate combat car squadron at Fort Riley was also transferred to Fort Knox, disbanded on arrival, and had its personnel and equipment incorporated into the new division. At the time, the armored divisions were templated as 3 regiment divisions, 2 light and 1 medium. So number 3 was the 69th Armored Regiment. The 69th Regiment comes from the original 1st, 4th, 5th, and 6th tank companies that were converted into the 1st Battalion 68th Infantry light tanks back in January of 1940. This was subsequently converted into 3rd Battalion 67th Infantry medium tanks when that regiment was activated at Fort Benning on June 5th. This battalion was redesignated 3rd Battalion 67th Armored Regiment medium when the Armored Force was created on July 15th. And quickly thereafter redesignated 3rd Battalion 69th Armored Medium on July 31st. It was concurrently redesignated 1st Battalion with its companies re-lettered. Its personnel were transferred from Fort Benning to Fort Knox, the 1st Armored Division station. Vexingly, there's no linear relationship between the 69th Armored and 69th Infantry, which was an inactive light tank regiment at the time and was disbanded in 1944. With the 2nd Armored Division, meanwhile, the 66th Infantry and 68th Infantry became the 66th and 68th Armored Regiments Light. The 67th Infantry became the 67th Armored Regiment Medium, but the resources of its 1st and 3rd Battalions were used to create other units. Personnel and equipment of its 1st Battalion were transferred to the 70th Tank Battalion GHQ Reserve, while it got its light tanks from 1st Battalion of 66th Armored. Personnel and equipment of the 3rd Battalion 67th Armored were reflagged as 1st Battalion of the 69th Armored Regiment as explained before, with personnel being used to stand up the 69th Regiment's HHC and 2nd Battalion. After the redesignations, personnel from the 1st of the 66th Armored were transferred to the 68th Armored Regiment, while the tanks of the 2nd Battalion 68th Armored were transferred to the 1st Armored Division. However, pretty quickly after Pearl Harbor, the Armored Division was restructured as 2 mixed armored regiments instead of 3 pure ones. The odd regiments out were the 68th and 69th Armored. These 2 regiments were initially inactivated in January of 1942 and reactivated in February as part of the new 6th Armored Division. However, as armored divisions were reorganized again in 1943 from the heavy structure with 2 armored regiments into a light structure with 3 separate tank battalions, these regiments were split up. From 1943, the new battalions were the 69th, 68th, and 15th Tank Battalions under the 6th Armored Division, and the separate 708th and 773rd Tank Battalions. These were quickly reorganized as amphibian tank battalions for service in the Pacific. The 86th Cavalry Recon Squadron under the 6th Armored Division also received their recon company from each of the old armored regiments. As for the rest of those separate tank battalions, the National Guard tank companies formed some of the first American tank units to enter combat. After the National Guard began mobilizing in September of 1940, 4 light tank battalions were created for the armored force and put under the 1st Tank Group GHQ Reserve. The first was the 192nd Tank Battalion in November and December of 1940, formed from the 32nd, 33rd, 37th, and 38th Tank Companies at Fort Knox. The 193rd Tank Battalion followed shortly after at Fort Benning in January of 1941, using the 30th, 31st, 36th, and 45th Tank Companies. The 194th at Fort Lewis, Washington was third up, using the 34th, 35th, and 40th Tank Companies. And lastly, the 191st Tank Battalion at Fort Meade with the 27th, 26th, 29th, and 43rd Tank Companies. Of these, the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalion, except for the latter's Company B based on the 35th Tank Company, were deployed to the Philippines. They arrived in Manila on September 26th and November 20th, 1941 and were put under the Provisional Tank Group U.S. Army Forces in the Far East. They were among the forces surrendered at Bataan on April 9, 1942. Company B of the 194th left behind in the US went on to be redesignated the separate 602nd Tank Company Medium and was posted to Alaska. They were placed under the control of the Missouri 138th Infantry Regiment and briefly equipped with Marmon Harrington CTLS light tanks left over from export to the Dutch East Indies and rejected Lend-Lease to China. The 602nd received campaign credit for the Aleutian Islands. The 191st and 193rd were spared the same fate. The 193rd was relocated to Hawaii after Pearl Harbor and arrived in January of 1942. A cadre from the battalion combined with the 11th Tank Company to form the 762nd and 763rd Tank Battalions Light. The 766th Tank Battalion Light was also formed there the next year. All 4 battalions were placed under the 4th Tank Group Light, but after all force conversion from light to medium tank battalions in November and December of 1943, this was redesignated the 4th Armored Group. They went on to fight in various operations in the Pacific, usually attached to the 27th Infantry Division at company scale. The 191st Tank Battalion, meanwhile, was reorganized as a medium tank battalion in August of 1942 and fought attached to the 45th Infantry Division in Italy, France, and Germany from 1943 to 1945. Its companies A and C were among the units that liberated Dachau. Lastly, 3 National Guard tank companies were needs of the Army. The 28th Tank Company of Pennsylvania was converted into Troop D, 104th Cavalry Regiment Horse Mechanized in September of 1940, part of its mechanized 2nd Squadron. Upon the conversion of the regiment to fully mechanized in April of 1942, it became Troop E, a support troop with light tanks. And finally, before deploying overseas, the 104th was converted into a mechanized cavalry group, with the original lineage of the company passing on to Troop D, 104th Cavalry Recon Squadron. The 104th group consisted of the 104th and 119th Squadrons. The group was not sent overseas and was inactivated in August of 1944, but the 104th Squadron did deploy, arriving in France in March of 1945 and being placed under the 115th Cavalry Group. The 41st Tank Company of Washington was converted into Company C of the 103rd Anti-Tank Battalion in September of 1940. Its following redesignations were mainly to do with how branch control of tank destroyer units would be handled, as it was redesignated as part of the 103rd Infantry Battalion Anti-Tank in June of 1941, and finally the 803rd Tank Destroyer Battalion in December. This battalion landed at Omaha Beach, France on June 13, 1944, and participated in the Normandy, Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central European campaigns. It was attached to at least 12 different divisions over the course of its overseas service. And lastly, for the first half of this video, the 44th Tank Company of New Jersey was, as far as I can tell, completely disbanded in September of 1940, around the time its division was inducted into federal service. Its few officers were transferred to the 114th Infantry, 44th Military Police Company, and 44th Signal Company, while its enlisted were dispersed within the 44th Division's Special Troops. Now, with the regular Army and National Guard out of the way, the Organized Reserve. This was basically the equivalent of the Army Reserve during the interwar period. They drilled without pay, but did often conduct summer training with the active duty tank units in their area. However, unlike today, it didn't generate formed units, or at least its peacetime organizations didn't. It was almost entirely officers, only a handful of enlisted personnel, and was thus more of a pool of trained officers on the hook for mobilizing the regular Army and National Guard. As a result, the units listed here were kind of inconsequential, but the whole reason battle order exists is we love the little details that don't matter. The biggest tank units in the Organized Reserve were 7 infantry tank regiments. These included 4 light tank regiments, the 420th, 424th, 425th, and 426th Infantry, and 3 heavy tank regiments, the 421st, 422nd, and 423rd Infantry. Their postings are listed on screen. There were also 33 divisional tank companies in the Organized Reserve divisions, 6 in the cavalry divisions, and 27 in the infantry divisions. None of the reserve infantry divisions were activated until 1942, years after light tank companies were dropped from the org, and the cavalry divisions were never activated. As well, it's likely that these companies were mostly empty of reserve officers by then due to the expansion of the Army. Additionally, there were 4 divisional tank companies and the entire 69th Infantry Regiment light tanks with regular Army inactive status. Essentially, these were inactive parts of regular Army units organized with reserve officers. Interestingly, 1st Cavalry Division's 10th Tank Company ended up fighting with 1st Cav as the 603rd Separate Tank Company during the war. As it was not yet redesignated until after the division shipped out to Australia, it was probably the only of the pre-war divisional tank companies to make it overseas with its original name. Note that before 1940, elements of the 67th and 68th Infantry were also regular Army inactive, and when their elements were reactivated, they usually did so without their peacetime reserve personnel. The 69th Infantry in particular was disbanded in 1944 and was not integrated into the lineage of the 69th Armored Regiment. The Organized Reserve Infantry tank regiments, though, were reorganized into tank battalions on January 30th, 1942, but not activated into federal service immediately. The specific ones are listed on screen now. Of these, only the 782nd saw combat. This battalion, formerly the 421st Infantry Heavy Tanks, was activated without reserve personnel on February 1st, 1943 at Fort Campbell. They used the 421st Infantry's original distinctive unit insignia featuring an elephant and motto "Treat 'em tough," and that battalion went on to fight in the ETO as a medium tank battalion, redesignated as such on October 19, 1943. However, when it was activated, it took a cadre of enlisted from the 7th Armored Division and officers from the 6th and 9th Tank Groups and OCS, so it was really only the 421st Infantry in heraldic terms. Another side case was the 781st. The 424th Infantry Light Tanks was redesignated as the 781st Tank Battalion Light. However, it was never activated and was disbanded after the war. But unrelated to that, a different 781st Tank Battalion was constituted anew on January 2, 1943, and did fight in the ETO, but these units were unrelated to each other. If you want to keep learning, check out this video about US Army Armored Force organization during World War II to see how these units were organized for combat. I'll see you over there.